All right, folks. So if you don't know what's going on right now, a few days ago I did a video right after the election result was called, and I had asked for questions, and somebody had asked me, um, what do we do with the fact that 70 million people voted for Donald Trump, and even though he's a horrible person, and so a bunch of people started to throw in comments what they thought about that, and one of the questions was about cults and cult behavior. And I had said at the time that I am not an expert in this. This is not my area of expertise. I can talk about American political history. I can talk about election procedures. I can talk about election, history and American politics, but cults are not my thing. But as it happens, I know exactly the person to call. And so here we are. So right now we are recording this conversation between myself and one of my dearest friends, Howard Ingham. And Howard is the cult expert, literally, literally the cult expert.
I'm not the cult expert.
You are
I
the
know
cult
a bit
expert.
about cults.
You are the cult expert in this conversation.
I'm writing a book about it at the moment.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm nearly finished. I've written a book about it, and it's nearly finished. And it'll be coming
Yay.
out very soon. I'm just editing it together now, which is the painful bit. Yeah. So you want to talk about
Okay,
cults and Trump cult?
we will, but what I was saying that we had this idea that both of us would get into this conversation, and that he, sorry, see, I blew it, and they could talk about. You can narrate that. They could talk about cults and cult behavior, and in exchange, because they have their own audience, who is largely based in the UK, that I could talk about American politics and American political history in a way that could be understandable, because apparently that's a thing that I do now.
Yeah, and you're very good at it as well, which
Who
is
knew?
good. I've learned an awful lot from you.
So if we're going to introduce, I guess we should be introducing each other. So to the people on my end of things, this is my buddy Howard, and they're going to talk about cults and cult behavior, and how that interrelates with what we were seeing with Trumpism. And they are in Wales, and I'm at my desk in New York. So.
And this is my friend Avril, who I've known for nearly a decade, and who has always had my back, always. And they, for various reasons, partly due to heritage and partly due to just paying attention, Avril is better at describing American politics than anybody else I know, and also has correctly called every step of this electoral campaign almost exactly, and the only person I know who has correctly called it at every possible stage.
For the record, at the moment, the only thing that I did not have on my map was Georgia. I didn't think that we would flip Georgia, but
right.
Every other thing, including Arizona, I had that.
Yeah.
The final count, they're still counting. But
you had 289, didn't you?
I had 289. And if he takes Arizona, he'll be at 290. The only thing that I didn't actually have was I didn't anticipate the one single electoral vote point in Nebraska.
Right. Right. Did he get Nebraska?
He got one. Nebraska.
Oh, Nebraska split, isn't it?
Yeah, proportionally.
So we got a point from Nebraska.
We got a point from Nebraska.
Okay.
That
you weren't expecting Nebraska. Yeah.
No,
okay.
I wasn't anticipating the point from Nebraska.
Okay. That's closer than most people. Most projections were like offering like complete wipeouts and things like that.
No, I had him at 289.
But we're going to talk a bit about why there wasn't a complete wipeout.
Yeah.
Right. So
where do you want to start?
Okay. Well, a lot of people have been talking about the idea of cults and the Trump thing as being a cult, and QAnon as being a cult, and the alt-right as being a cult. And I think we need to talk about what cultic behavior is like and what brainwashing is, because what people are accusing other people of being brainwashed, okay, on both sides, absolutely. Okay, and I think in movies you get this idea that brainwashing happens when, you know, I don't know, like in a 1960s spy movie where someone gets put in a machine and they're made to stare at a spiral, and then they're like made to like change stuff, and they're sort of turned into like zombie slaves and that sort of thing. And that's not really how it works. Okay, that's not how it works. Generally, what we mean when someone is being brainwashed is that they have a view of the world that is not the same as another segment of society, which may be the majority, is usually the majority. And this has been achieved through a series of social controls, because human beings are social creatures. Now, the one person who has done more directed, written, and explicit work on this subject in history is the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, who knew exactly what he was doing when he was actually getting people. Because people, you know, people used to talk about the Moonies. When Moon died, the Moonies basically just collapsed.
Right.
The Moonies aren't a thing, and they exist, but they're dying. Okay, Reverend Moon was so in control of the Moonies that when he died, there was no one to take over.
Right.
Okay. So that's neither here nor there. But the point is, so Moon realized that essentially what you needed to keep people on your side was to have them surrounded by people who were all reifying what you're supposed to believe, keeping them busy, and keeping them isolated from other points of view. And also using a method of control that Moon originally called love bombing. Now, this gets used a lot on the internet and it gets misused and stuff, but in his initial conception, the simple idea is that the community would shower a new convert with love and support and free meals and a place to stay and all sorts of things, and listen to their problems and all those things, until the moment they ask a question that they're not supposed to ask, or make a point, or do an action that they're not supposed to do, at which point it's all withdrawn at a stroke. And Moon did it deliberately. Moon arranged for it to be done deliberately to people. But you see churches do it just as a thing. It's behavior. It's flock behavior of people, right? Particularly when they feel like it's us versus them. So that us versus them thing. So Moon talks about how you're not supposed to talk with outsiders, that they're dangerous. The Scientologists talk about suppressive persons, SPs, who you're not supposed to have anything to do with. When I was with the evangelicals, which I was for several years, you know, and one of the reasons that I know about this is because I've been through a lot of this, is that, you know, people were weird if you started going out with someone who was even part of a different church, right? Let alone someone who wasn't actually a Christian. Okay. People were weird about it because you're being, and you know, in the Bible there's the line in one of the epistles of Paul, do not be yoked with an unbeliever, which they're basically Christian students interpret as don't date an atheist. Moon also worked out that you could actually brainwash someone really quickly by convincing them that they'd love to come on one of your retreats for a weekend or two, for a week, and then not letting people sleep, getting them to endless singing meetings, getting them to endless worship meetings, not feeding them enough, and essentially putting them through a friendly Guantanamo Bay situation where you would essentially, and essentially basically traumatizing and abusing these people into the position where they don't know who they are, and then they're vulnerable and they're tired and they're hungry and they're malnourished, and keeping them malnourished, right? Apparently, because you heard reports in the 70s of women in the Moonies who stopped having periods. They're so malnourished. but also spinning this like that's a good thing because it's making them pure, right? Right. Yes, I saw those eyes roll, right? Okay. But that's kind of relevant because any abusive shit can be spun to make it look like a good thing in these situations. If you've ever been in a controlling and abusive relationship, that is like being in bad religion. Because religion is a relationship. It's a network of social relationships, but it's a personal relationship.
And that's kind of like if at that moment that we can interject that there is like there's like different parts of this, right? There's a lot of working parts. There's the part where you have Trump's fan club, and then you have he himself, and he, because he is absolutely a malignant narcissist, which I could talk about forever and ever and ever and have. Um, he is exactly that guy. He is exactly the guy that, it's all great until you say no to him about anything, and then he completely loses it, and it's like a switch. It goes from immediately from everything's great to you're the worst person in the world. And you see that he does that over and over. He eventually underbusses every single person who was ever involved with him. There is no way to avoid it. And it's the thing about like how the conveyor belt only goes one way, where and this is, I usually apply this in the spectrum of like a working relationship, like when your boss is a malignant narcissist, that the conveyor belt only goes one way, because like he'll get somebody to do a job and then he'll underbust that person. The next person is never better than the last person, because anybody better than the first person knows not to take the job. They're just too smart to do it. And so you get progressive people who are progressively not as bright, not as competent, not as capable, until at the end of the cycle you are just left with literally just whatever he can scrape out of the bottom of the barrel.
You're left with a press conference in front of a landscaping company.
That's exactly what you're left with.
And of course the abusive boyfriends, the the gaslighting boyfriend, the wife beating husband who's a cop, or they're the same thing as a cult leader. The difference is a matter of degree, right? It's a matter of control, that matter of like, I'll never hurt you, I'll just come back in, it's okay. It hurts me more than it hurts you. Although the abusive parent thing, all of those things. And these things happen in churches and cults. Now, how you get this, the thing is, right, we're all brainwashed. Brainwashing isn't, we call it brainwashing because it's when people start being different to us.
Okay.
But technically, our society works like this. Okay. I have seen some of the most, I've got to be honest, some of the worst behavior I've seen on the internet has been internet progressives towards each other. Someone steps out of line or describes something in the wrong way. Someone says, wait a minute, what if, this wasn't actually true? And suddenly they're cancelled, right? And the right cancel more than the left do. It's also important actually to sort of see on what grounds people get booted out as well, because this is important as well, right? Because one thing I constantly hear is, why are people not upset about the grab them by the pussy comment? Why were the evangelical right not in arms about this? And there are a number of reasons why that's the case, why people might be okay. One thing that really, really interested me, as well as being utterly enraging, was the way that in the last couple of months, every so often, Mr. Trump has said something like, what if I postpone the election? Or there's totally some electoral fraud going on. And people who have been okay with children in cages, with suspicious payouts to actors who he may have spent some time with, to $500 million in debt that we don't know where it's for. But the moment he says, you know, well, we did some jiggery pokery with the election, people are like, wait a minute, mister. No. Hang on.
And
No.
and because then see, now we're going back to the realm of the political, and now I can, that becomes a matter of state sovereignty. And at the end of the day, nobody, apparently that apparently is the line. Apparently that was the line. It was
It's a
state sovereignty.
doctrinal line.
That everything was, they kind of went into people would go into contortions to allow things to take place and make excuses for them until that moment, because at that moment it was a matter of like sort of a bedrock position of American culture, a bedrock position of American stability. It was also a matter of, again, state sovereignty, which is why every time he brings up these legal challenges, I just keep laughing, like I can't stop, because all of them basically would involve some level of violating state sovereignty. And if he thinks that there's a state in the union that's going to have it, boy, is he in for a surprise. But the thing is that he couldn't do this on his own. He
No.
he managed to bilk the hell out of Atlantic City, New Jersey. New York was done with him in the 90s. New York City was done with him in the 90s.
Which is why people were dancing in the streets this week.
Oh, yeah. But he wouldn't be in the position he's in were it not for the help of Fox. Rupert Murdoch is responsible for this.
Which brings us to another point.
Yes.
The point about separation and the point about not hearing versions of the world that are not yours. And this is actually also hugely important, right? So I remember that when I was with the evangelicals, as it were, there were Christian books. You read Christian books, right? You avoided not reading Christian books unless you were actually had a Christian rebuttal at hand in order to take it. So, for example, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, right? There are several Christian evangelical takedowns of The God Delusion. There's one by a guy called Alistair McGrath called Dawkins God, which is actually pretty good, but hilariously, but because The God Delusion has lots wrong with it in terms of how it deals with things like human philosophy and about psychology and linguistics and stuff. But I digress. And likewise, it's really interesting. You particularly see, I know a lot of people on the hard left, because I'm quite hard left myself, and you see people who have strong opinions about which obscure Marxist thinker you should read. Strong opinions, okay? And you find that in every field. The pagans, you find that among like the sort of occult groups who I've sort of hobnobbed with from time to time. And there are strong opinions about what you should read and what you shouldn't. And in what we've got with the polarization of the USA, which goes back decades, okay, which is where the fairness doctrine came in, and which you talked about the other day. But the polarization has meant that it is quite, and also the internet, weirdly, the internet should be able to give everybody much more of a wide view, but what it actually does is creates bubbles. And the polarization has meant that there are outlets that you could listen to and outlets that you shouldn't listen to, and outlets that you don't believe by default. And this actually sort of works both ways, right? Like Fox News sometimes says stuff that's true, okay?
Yeah.
All right. But I think it's fair to say that many Democrats in the USA would probably, if someone on Fox, if Tucker Carlson said that grass was green, a Democrat would have to go outside and check
I would go out inside and check.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Okay. Izzy goes the other way, and it's made more so because the cult leader is basically saying that the New York Times, which he has a complex relationship
Yeah.
but CNN, MSNBC, the BBC, the Guardian are fake news. He's basically telling them that one source of information is true and one source of information is false.
Well, you know, I had,
And
or his favorite, the Washington Post, because you know how much he loves Jeff Bezos. we, we, but you know, what, one of the things, and I had said this in that talk the other day, but I'm going to basically repeat it for the people on your end, it's really hard, it's really important for people to understand that we did not come to this moment in one fell swoop. We came to this moment from a decision or a series of decisions that was made in 1980, that we didn't just, this didn't, he didn't just materialize. He didn't just like fall out of like, you know, fully formed like Athena out of the forehead of Zeus. That's not how this happened. This happened with a series of decisions that began in 1980 when Ronald Reagan's people realized, because they are not stupid, that they were going to have to do something to increase the amount of people who were actively political within the Republican Party.
yeah,
That over time their numbers had shrunk to a point where in very short order they were no longer going to be able to win in national elections. That there just weren't going to be enough people. Demographics were not going to be kind to them in the future, and they just needed more bodies. And instead of actually changing their policies, like instead of actually saying, okay, well, how do we appeal to more people while still maintaining these values that we believe in,
that
they
would
didn't
move
do
the
that.
Overton window to the left.
Right. They didn't do that. What they did was they revamped what is known as the Southern Strategy, which was a thing that went on between 1968 and 1972. The original Southern Strategy basically used race as a, deliberately, it was completely astroturf. They used race as a wedge issue in order to get more people active and voting for Republicans, and using race as the big scary thing that they were going to get people, and it worked. It absolutely worked. But at that point, they'd kind of run out of that flavor of racist. Like there weren't any more of them to like to grab. They'd run out of that particular flavor of racist. I mean, you
Only
know,
so many white hoods you can get.
you know, the racists that were left were like more sort of casual racist, low key. You know, it wasn't, they weren't going to grab anybody else. So what they did was they made a decision, and this again, this was not something that happened magically. No one waved a wand. It was a series of choices. They decided to uh, go after and try to incorporate groups that were up to this point largely just apolitical, which was essentially the religious conservative groups in the US, largely evangelical. Um,
Yeah.
and prior to that point, I think, you know, if you're not old enough to really remember this, you just, it doesn't mean anything to you. But prior to the 80s, American evangelicals, they were just doing their own thing. Like they, you know, they passed like really hyper local elections, like within their own communities, their own parishes, their own counties. They weren't real, had no political ambitions. They were just doing their own thing with their own people, and that was kind of it. They had their own enclaves. But in 1980, they, you know, they were welcomed into the Republican Party in a much greater way, and in order to pad those numbers. And the way that they did it was they just started to use issues that were important to religious folks as wedge issues. So things like abortion, which is always reliable, things like gay rights, things like any kind of equality that wasn't, you know, they went up against atheists, they went up against anybody, you know, anything that was, that they could see that could be
Free
used as a
speech
wedge issue.
stuff.
Yeah. um
Making a cake for a gay couple.
yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
And they absolutely use that as a wedge issue in order to get them to be active and politically engaged voters. And it worked. It absolutely worked. It worked like a charm. They got a whole influx of not only new people, but people who, and this is really crucial, would not only vote, but would vote as a block. They would vote en masse, and they would always vote the exact same way. They would vote however their religious leaders told them to vote. And technically in the US, technically, this is not legal. This is not really legal, because the whole point of the fact that churches in the US don't pay taxes is because they are supposed to be apolitical entities. But the IRS just doesn't enforce that one, because if we did,
There's a reason the IRS doesn't enforce that one. I have a very close friend who is an investigator for the IRS, and the IRS is a hugely beleaguered part of the American government. I think there are large parts of the American government that is outgoing who would like to see the IRS gone altogether. Pretty much. The IRS is very, very underfunded.
which is ironic, but
Yeah.
but technically you shouldn't be able to do this, and yet it's like overlooked, like it's not a thing. And throughout the 80s, they just kept increasing their roles with more and more and more of these conservative religious voters.
Right.
And the key to them was that they were dead reliable. They came out for every election. They voted, they would vote however their religious leaders told them to.
Because it's a matter of life and death.
Right.
So,
And it worked like an absolute charm. And in 1989, we get what's called the Christian Coalition, which is where, because in exchange, it's not like they came for nothing. Like there was a trade. The trade was that we get all these voters, but we have to actually give them power. And that was where it got scary, because it wasn't just a bunch of new voters voting for traditional GOP candidates. It was like they wanted to put up their own candidates. They suddenly wanted to become very engaged in the political process. And over time, you see like more and more religious candidates show up in American elections.
like Mike Pence.
Like Mike Pence, but even before Mike Pence, Mike Huckabee,
Yep.
came long before that. You can go back and you can go back to a whole bunch of them. There's a whole string of them that were part of that whole sort of Christian thing. And the thing is, though, that group of people wasn't enough. And here's where it gets really important. And I want to explain to people who are overseas who really don't get this, that group by itself over time, because it didn't do anything to stop the attrition. Like all it did was move everybody to the right. It didn't stop the fact that the country in general wasn't doing that, and that younger people weren't taking that kind of conservative mindset on. And so over time, it was still like having a bucket with a hole in it. People were just disappearing. And if they left the church, or they died, or whatever it was, there was really no one to replace them. And so over time, what's happened with the GOP is that in order to keep the stands in the circus tent filled, they have to go to more and more and more outrageous lengths to get people in the tent. And so that's how you ultimately get the Tea Party movement in 2010, where they were like the next step along, that sort of conspiracy theory laden paranoid road, like in 2010. And because they were needed to fill out the roles, because they were losing people left, right, and center.
And they were hugely astroturfed.
Yeah, 100% astroturfed. There's not a single thing about the Tea Party movement that was grassroots, despite what anybody says. They were funded by the Koch brothers.
And strategized by Rick Wilson.
Yeah, we can blame him for that.
Yeah, we're going to blame him for that.
And now you have QAnon, and all QAnon is the next step along that same road. And the GOP will embrace them too, because without continually grabbing these more and more fringe groups, they run out of people.
Which is a good point, actually, to talk about how the mechanics of QAnon, because you see people getting turned by QAnon, people are calling QAnon a cult. Why is QAnon so effective? Why is the alt-right so effective? Why? In fact, also, it goes back to why Donald Trump is so effective, actually, at doing what he wants. Because, okay, one thing, Okay, the first thing is people look at stuff that Donald Trump says and the stuff on QAnon and even some of the alt-right shit, you know, like the nonsense Ben Shapiro sort of goes on about and that kind of thing, right? Seriously, does anybody listen to Ben Shapiro? The guy is a blithering fool, right? But obviously, just like a drooling idiot. Anyway, he kind of did. Okay, so cult leaders are generally thought to be hugely charismatic and magnetic individuals. But the fact is that they're only charismatic and magnetic to the people they are charismatic and magnetic to.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And this is vitally important. Cult stuff never, ever works on everybody. Right? And there's a number of reasons for that. One is that people only ever convert to any kind of religion or ideology, and politics and religion are kind of the same thing here, really. They only ever convert if there's something in them ready to convert. The psychological model of conversion depends upon you needing something, having a hole in you that needs to be filled, or if you like, a bomb in you that needs to be detonated. And you have to be there at the right time and the right place for someone to say the right thing to detonate that bomb. Okay? You need to have that I see it all now moment. Okay? And then you spend a lot of time consolidating that, and you either go off home and think, you know what, I might just have a beer, or you meet a bunch of other like-minded people who go, yes, come and join us. I come to our bake sale, come to our QAnon bake sale, and we shall give you QAnon cakes and all that sort of thing, right? And come and stay at our QAnon retreats where we will have QAnon meetings and sing QAnon songs and that sort of thing. Obviously, that's not really happens, but the point being that you have a turnaround and you consolidate it because you've had this hole. You had to be ready for it. If you weren't ready for it, it isn't work. It's one of the reasons why, you know, you go to football matches and you see people holding up massive signs that say John 3:16, right? And, you know, having been an evangelical, I can tell you that as God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And people go, well, all right, it's John 3:16. Is that verse from the Bible? God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. And in fact, really, the reason why they're doing that is because it worked on them. They think it's a magic bullet for everyone because it was their magic bullet. It's the same reason you see new atheists, and there's this line that stupid thing Douglas Adams said about, you know, why look for fairies at the bottom of the garden when you can see how pretty the flowers are, or some nonsense like that. And new atheists love wheeling that out, and they love wheeling that out because it was their magic bullet. It was their moment of enlightenment, their moment, you know, the exploding brain beam moment. And we've all had them. I had that moment once or twice, and you never get over it. Even if you stop believing in this sort of thing, it does change you. It's actually a kind of weird sort of psychological trauma in that respect. And it's so effective with Donald Trump because he's incoherent. Okay. Follow me here, because this is also, you can also see how it's effective with QAnon. Okay, so there is a psychological phenomenon that human beings generally have, and it's one of the things that makes us human, okay, and it's called apophenia. Okay, and apophenia is the tendency of people to find patterns in things where there are no patterns. It's the root of human intuition. It's the reason we make intuitive jumps and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. But sometimes it can be weaponized. So one of the ways in which Q, who I think was unmasked as a bloke from 8chan or something, not an intelligence analyst or anything, right? What Q does is that when he gives one of his dispatches, he goes, here is a suspicious thing. Here is a suspicious thing. Here is another suspicious thing. But wait, here's a suspicious thing. Do the research. And these things, some of them aren't true. Some of them are true and probably genuinely suspicious. Some of them are, if you squint at them, could be suspicious. But they're not connected. But because they're juxtaposed in such a way, and then he says, do the research. People go and do wild Googles and find the conspiracy stuff and do the research and find a connection and create a narrative. And they create, it's kind of an IKEA narrative, okay? It's kind of narrative. And a with a, yeah. Anyway, the IKEA narrative is sort of, you get it in a flat pack. And there's only one way the narrative goes together, right? You're going to get a pretty Scandinavian narrative that will sit in your corner, right? That you can put books on. But you still feel a sense of achievement because you made that narrative yourself. You built that narrative. I mean, it's not even a Lego narrative because at least you can take it apart and build something else with it. It's an IKEA narrative. There's only one way to build it, okay? It's a pre-packed narrative that gives you the illusion of having built it yourself. And when you have built that narrative yourself, you are much less likely to abandon that narrative, which is where the IKEA metaphor throws out because it's all crap. But the point being, Trump kind of does that because Trump can't even put together a fucking complete sentence.
Right.
I remember reading about a Japanese interpreter who was tearing her hair out because none of this could make any sense in Japanese because you couldn't translate it.
What's so funny is that years ago, it was like one of the most popular things that got written on SLU was during the 2016 campaign. He had done this speech and somebody from Germany was like, I cannot make any sense out of this. And I was just like, I am so sorry that I can do this, but I can translate this. And I translated the entire thing into understandable terms because I have spoken that malignantly narcissistic language. I have heard that. I heard that for 35 years. And before I left. And and so I was able to translate it. And I hate that I can do it. I hate that when he speaks and says complete nonsense, that I actually understand what he's trying to say, but I can.
But the simple fact that people do understand what he's trying to say is that it creates that sense of apophenia because people are hearing what he's saying and feeling a sense of connection subconsciously because they have interpreted him, because he is speaking directly to them. It's like I guess the political speech equivalent of being in a charades game with that person who's totally in line with you and gets everything you come up with in seconds, even though no one can understand why, right?
Right.
It's exactly that, okay? So a lot of people watch Donald Trump, and because we're not inclined to hear what Trump is saying, we go, well, it's just nonsense, isn't it? But people are hearing it, and it is going bang, 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 and it's making those connections because they're making the connections, they're connecting, and they're holding on to it. Combined with the fact that he is essentially telling them what to listen to. I could say, hey, Trump voter, why are you okay with children in cages? They don't believe that there are children in cages.
Or they believe that there are, but that this isn't Trump's doing, that this is Barack Obama's doing.
Well, that's kind of complex because it kind of was.
Yeah.
The children in cages thing actually goes back to the Obama administration, although I doubt Mr. Biden's going to admit that.
It wasn't utilized in the same way.
Not on the industrial level that it is now, right? But they were doing it. They've been doing it since before Trump. But so yeah, but they can go. Yeah, it was Obama started that, and they can actually, you know, and it's like at least 50% true. Okay. Are you okay with? It's like, also you will, and I appreciate this. This goes on a personal level. And this is going to enrage you a bit, right? David Icke's 9/11 conspiracy theories. One of the things Icke does, one of his 9/11 conspiracy theories is, if planes crashed into the Pentagon, why are there no photographs of plane wreckage by the Pentagon? Right? That's his big magic bullet question. And the easiest and most obvious thing in the world is to spend 30 seconds on Google and go, well, here's a picture of some plane wreckage by the Pentagon. At which point they'll go, yeah, but look at the JPEG artifacting on that picture. Or, yes, but that's not near the Pentagon. Or, that's not the flight that was near the Pentagon. Or, that's not real. Or, that was made in 2004 after the fact. And they'll find reasons, because it's actually, and here's the other thing, the final thing I want to say, people are more likely to hang on to belief and faith in things when there is no evidence. Evidence isn't just unnecessary, it's actually actively malignant. They don't need evidence, and actually evidence is inconvenient, right? Because evidence is falsifiable, as Karl Popper would have it. You can actually disprove evidence.
So here we are. Okay, so we start at the point, you know, we start at this point, and back in the 80s, and then we go with the dismantling of the fairness doctrine in American media, which gives rise to
Fox News
and attack media, people like Rush Limbaugh, and the fact that walking freaking bow tie Tucker Carlson and that whole group of people, whatever. And how, at this point, though, there are 70 million people who have decided, for whatever reasons they have, that this guy is somehow preferable, and they voted for him. What do you even do with that? Like, how do you begin to see? I don't, you know what? And I've said this in several videos, but I don't even care that they disagree with me about policy or whatever. I don't understand. What my objection to is that we no longer share a consensus reality, and that's the part. It's got nothing to do with agreement about a thing or not. Like, we can agree that Donald Trump is an absolute piece of shit, or we may not. But the thing that I cannot wrap my head around, I can't do it, and it's why I don't even bother, is that we no longer live in the same consensus reality. There was a time that you and I both remember where, whether we agree or disagree with people who are different from us politically, we at least lived in the same consensus reality.
Yes.
And we don't anymore.
No. I mean, and part of that is the way that the internet has created, ironically, a way in which you never actually have to see media that disagrees with you if you don't want to. And this also goes back to a very interesting and peculiar thing that happened to an American journalist for the New York Times. I can't remember his name, but he was in the White House, and a senior White House official in the Bush administration, this is Bush Mark II, said, yeah, well, you guys in the reality-based community, you sort of think that on the whole. And the journalist said that he sort of took it as a compliment and said, well, we are part of the reality-based community. We work on evidence and everything. And the official went, no, you don't get that. we decide what reality is. Reality is what we say it is, and it doesn't matter what you guys do. Doesn't matter what evidence you have. Reality is ours. And that, back then, W wasn't a cult leader, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was, ironically, I think, probably the last old school American president. I think, in a lot of ways. He's part of, a dynastic thing, but the cult leader makes your consensus reality what the cult leader says it is. And for everyone watching, by the way, cult leader is a metaphor here, right? Trump is doing the thing that a cult leader does without actually there being a cult, and it's easy to call it that. There is a cult of personality there. It's a personality cult, not a religious one. I think as far as what we do depends upon what the accepted texts start saying now. Because who did Fox News call the election for?
Right. The funny thing is that it's become very clear that Fox has kind of abandoned him.
Yes.
And
although Tommy Lahren and Tucker Carlson are still
whatever
doing the fraud line, but
it doesn't make any difference. The only person that matters at Fox News in this scenario is Rupert Murdoch, and he has made it perfectly clear through his actions that he's tired of this. He's tired of it.
Yeah.
And the thing that one needs to fully, and I think that most people kind of get this, is that Trump himself really isn't anything. He's like he's a face in a suit, a badly fitting suit, and a whatever. But he really doesn't have any money. Like I don't know how. This is a guy that bankrupted 3 casinos. This should be mathematically impossible. This is a guy that owes somewhere between 425 million and 1.5 billion in personal debt that will become, billion with a B in personal debt that will come due in the next 12 months. He doesn't have any real assets of his own. He doesn't even, he keeps leasing out his name to support his lifestyle brand. But Rupert Murdoch has actual money.
Yeah, he's one of the most powerful men in the world.
And, and so when he can just cut Trump off. And it's kind of like what my line through this whole thing, when Mike Bloomberg decided that he was going to run for office for 20 minutes during this, and I got really annoyed with this because Mike Bloomberg is a legit billionaire.
Yeah.
Like legit money. His personal worth is something like 58 billion with a B dollars.
It's funny how he's not in any of the weird anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
Well, that is kind of weird. You'd think that
they'd all be out for Bloomberg.
You think that they would, but they're so stuck on you know what?
Soros. Yeah. Let's just leave that one.
Yeah, leave that one alone.
All right.
But the thing about Mike Bloomberg, and I said this at the time when he decided he was going to run for the 20 minutes that he decided to do it, was I was really angry. And because if he really gave a shit, the answer would have been to take some pocket change and buy Fox News. And he wouldn't even need, and everyone was like, oh yeah, he could shut it down. And I was like, no. I don't want him to shut it down.
Change the news content.
That's it. All I wanted him to do was to buy it and just make it factual. I don't care that it's conservative. It can be conservative. There's room for conservative news sources. There are plenty of perfectly legitimate.
Because Bloomberg News is apparently a fairly solid right-wing news source.
It is actually, it's completely factual. It's not even right-wing. It's like the AP. It just reports things. but the thing is, I don't even care if it's in conservative packaging. I don't care. There's room for that. There's absolutely room for, conservative news sources. The Hill skews right, and Politico, skews right, and the Christian Science Monitor skews right, and the Wall Street Journal skews right, and all of that is perfectly okay. My problem with Fox is that they have created their own reality that has nothing to do with actual reality. And if Mike Bloomberg really gave a shit, he could have bought it for pocket change. He could have thrown, $4
But
billion.
would
What?
Rupert Murdoch have given up the chance to have his own voice piece in the US?
How much money you got? He can be bought.
I don't know.
I mean, or at least whatever. Just change just change it so that it's actually news. And I don't care if it's conservative. I just care that it's factual. And that was really my thing. It was like, if he really cared about this, that's the way to go with it. But it didn't matter in the end. But now you're talking about, like, my problem with Fox has nothing to do with the fact that it's conservative, and everything to do with the fact that it's bullshit. For the record, I don't actually watch CNN. I don't watch any of these broadcast media. I don't watch any of it. When I was doing all of that analysis that you were so impressed with, I did it without ever once turning on the television. I did it with a map and math, and that was all I needed to predict it all correctly. And actually watching television, whether it would have been on the left or on the right, it would have been made things more inaccurate had I used broadcast media to use in my analysis of the election, because the skew doesn't help me. Show me the numbers. Show me a map. Show me the numbers. Show me, like, where the district lines are, and I can predict your election. And that's true. I mean, that's exactly how I did it. And I said in one of the videos I did, if you're watching, a friend of mine in London was like, "Oh, let me turn off CNN," and I was like, "Yes, turn it off. Turn all of it off. Go look at a map. Go look at the interactive map, like the one that's on the New York Times, an interactive map that's on, anything, just some sort of a map where you can see how many votes have been cast, how many votes are left, and what the electoral content is of everything. And it's so much better than watching any of these news shows. But when we dismantled the fairness doctrine, and let me put it like this: people keep calling to reinstate the fairness doctrine. And I have a friend that makes a really good point. My friend Kim makes a really good point and says it is too late now to do that. The fairness doctrine made all kinds of sense before the internet, because there was a narrow way for people to get their news.
Yeah.
And now that doesn't exist anymore. There is no way to make the fairness doctrine a thing again. But what we can do is make lying expensive again. And I don't, we can't reinstate the fairness doctrine because there's no way to do that with the internet. But we can make specific rules about broadcast media that calls itself news and make lying very expensive. Make deliberate lying very expensive. But the question now is, what do we do? What do we do with this 70 million people who, at least, and it's not all 70 million of them, because, to be honest, a good chunk of American Republicans have already just sort of shrugged their shoulders at this election result, because everybody in this country is exhausted. We are exhausted from all of this.
Also, Americans believe in elections.
Yes.
Largely, and one of the reasons, as I was saying earlier on, people were like going, "Wait a minute, mister," is because the democracy is sacrosanct. Right. It's basically the thing that you can't get past. You can't give up democracy. And I mean, there are the outright and some of the related groups like the neo-feudalist libertarians and things like that might not think democracy is worth it anymore. There was actually a libertarian thinker who was taken seriously who suggested that Steve Jobs should be dictator of California. Right. Yeah, I know, right? That's the level. That's the level of neo-feudalist thinking, right? Okay, but but I moved on from extremist religion because I heard other things. I moved away from evangelicalism because I studied church history, and I don't know if that's going to work for everybody. I think people have to be willing to listen. People have to be willing to hear these things. I think you're right that a lot of Republicans are going to shrug their shoulders. I think that we're at a tipping point where the polarization is either going to become utterly impossible or it's going to ease off. Okay? I think that whatever one may think of Mr. Biden and his flaws, I think that his victory speech, where he basically said, we're going to bring everyone together and I'm going to be a president for everybody, was probably the single best thing he could have said. Whether or not you think it's okay to talk to someone who, voted for someone who thinks it is okay to put kids in cages and okay to murder black people on the streets by police, that's another issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Biden said the right thing.
I agree with that.
He said the right thing at the time. And that's entirely separate from the pain of people of color who, don't feel that they can talk to someone who felt that they should be dead. It's like, that's reasonable. Yes, of course. Of course, there's a lot of healing that's got to be done. There's a lot of things because some of the opinions that have been expressed are actually, let's call it, evil. Okay. And there have been evil things done. Okay. And that's not something you can sweep under the carpet. But in terms of the wider nation, Biden saying, I'm going to be a president for everybody, is probably the first step of the only way out of this on a wider sense.
That's certainly true. I mean, I think that, listen, Biden, he was not my first choice. He was not my second choice. He was not my third choice. And at the same time, I had called him and Kamala Harris actually from the jump. I only changed right at the end where I thought that maybe Stacey Abrams was going to take that VP slot.
Yeah.
Because it was right after she had lost the gubernatorial race to Brian Kemp, and it was so clear that election was stolen from her, and there was a sort of a movement in the South, and that but as it turned out, she wound up organizing 800,000 people in Georgia. No joke. My father, every time he refers to her, calls her General Stacey Abrams, commander of the armies of Georgia. Every time he
also writes awesome erotic thrillers.
So she did something incredible. Like, she had other people too who were helping her, but what she did was amazing. And that, again, like, my dad is like literally calls her General Stacey
Abrams,
commander of the armies of Georgia every single time, and which I think is very cute. But
I'd love to meet your dad one day.
But I had called Biden Harris really seriously the moment the election in 2016 was over. I called.
I can corroborate that you did. Yes.
Because it was the only It was the only combination that was going to make sense for various reasons.
Yeah,
And again, he
because
was not.
American politics.
Yeah, because and again, that's not my personal thing. Like I voted for Elizabeth Warren in the
Yep.
primary in 2016. In the 2016 primary, I voted for Bernie Sanders. I I'm not a centrist, okay? But the I knew where we were going. I knew where this was headed, and I will say that the in the next 72 days or whatever it is, it's 71 days, whatever it is now between now and the end of January, when Biden takes office, you know, it's true to suggest that it's going to be very dangerous because I don't, there's nothing he's really going to be able to do to flip the election in a way that he wants. But what I was saying in the video I did tonight, where there was barely any sound and nobody told me until half an hour in, was a few things. I said, I'll just go over it briefly. I said that, okay, so the legal challenges right now, I'm just basically going over what I said in this last video to the folks on your end who may not have heard this already. So there's a few different avenues here. No one should really be worried about any of them. There's only one of them that would almost work. The rest of them are Rocky and Bullwinkle plans. So the Rocky and Bullwinkle plans, in order, are the one where he was contesting when ballots came in. This has already not only been decided by the Supreme Court, this was decided by one of the most conservative justices on the Supreme Court. This is a Rocky and Bullwinkle plan. This is going nowhere. The rules, whatever state law was at the time of the election, is the thing that's going to be followed, and he's going to have nothing to do with that. The second Rocky and Bullwinkle plan, which is somehow even more hilarious, is he thinks that what could possibly happen is he could contest this on the grounds that there weren't enough poll watchers, that he'll claim election fraud, that there weren't enough poll watchers watching. Except that's already been heard in court too. And the judge literally, I mean, actually said, was there a non-zero number of your people in the room? Yes. I don't
Bye.
understand. Yeah, I don't, and the actual quote is, I don't understand what the problem is.
Yeah.
Like an actual judge said that. It was like, out.
I mean,
Ya.
it's a delaying move at that point, isn't it?
The third thing, which is kind of hilarious, and it took me a few minutes to figure out where he got this idea from, was that he was going to try to get electors to go rogue, to use faithless electors, to flip the electoral college result. And the way that
This
he was
rarely happens, though, does it?
it never happens. And in 2016, there were 7 total electors that went rogue, but they went rogue on both sides.
Oh.
5 on one side and 2 on the other. And it wasn't enough to flip anything. Okay, so there are 33 states with faithless elector laws. So most of the states that he is contesting already have faithless elector laws on the books. There's nothing he can do about this. Like, there's no way to get them to
Does he
flip.
explain faithless elector law means that you can't have a faithless elector? Is that what you...
Yeah, there's varying
Right.
penalties. There's varying penalties for this. The vote is canceled. There's a penalty for it. There's the vote is canceled and there's a penalty for it. But basically, there's 33 states out of 50 that have these kinds of laws, and we're only talking really about a handful of states that are in play here. Almost all of them have faithless elector laws, but one of the ones that doesn't have faithless elector laws, this is where it gets hilarious, is Pennsylvania.
Oh.
And so what he actually thought could happen was that the Pennsylvania legislature, who in that state are the ones that decide on the electors, would just pull all of the electors and fill that void with Trump loyalists and have all of them go rogue and take all 20 electoral votes and give them to Trump. This is beyond a Rocky and Bullwinkle plan. This is insanity. The whole reason he thought that this could possibly be a thing is because in Florida, the governor decides on the electors. So it's one guy that can basically go and take everybody out and put in whoever he wants.
Right.
And it's Ron DeSantis. And since Ron DeSantis is his buddy and he lives in Florida now, thank you, he thought that it was kind of the same like that everywhere. That's not going to work in Pennsylvania. Even though the legislature is controlled by Republicans, they have a Democratic governor, and no one wants to commit political suicide in Pennsylvania for this dude. Nobody. So, absolutely no one. So this is like a complete. Then there's the whole recount fiasco. So this is where we get to the grift. All right. So most of the states that he's trying to contest are what they call outside of the recount provision. Most states have a recount provision of a half a point. If it's less than half a point, you can ask for a recount.
It's less than that in Pennsylvania, though, isn't it?
No, it's not. It's greater than
Oh,
that. The only state that
or
it's
bigger than
not
that.
that
Sorry, yeah.
it's not is in Georgia. And they have an automatic recount procedure that the state pays for. So that's going to happen. There's going to be a recount in Georgia
Yeah,
automatically.
because so Georgia, if it's less than 0.5% difference, they immediately start again,
Yeah, they just recount.
which is what they're doing now.
Yes, they will recount.
Yeah.
But in other states, the rules are completely variable, and most states don't have an automatic recount procedure. Most of them have a requested recount procedure where the opponent has to request within a certain amount of time of the results being certified.
Right.
And so what happened in Wisconsin was he wanted to contest the results in Wisconsin. First of all, they are technically outside of the recount provision, but you can request it no matter how big the.
Right.
But he has to pay for it, and they told him it was going to be $3 million, and we haven't heard anything about this since then.
I didn't know that.
They told him it was going to be $3 million, and all of a sudden there's crickets. So here's the grift. Taxpayer money doesn't pay for all of this. This has to come from the RNC, the Republican National Committee. So he's sending out fundraising stuff. He's trying to fundraise.
An election protection fund.
Yeah, he's trying to fundraise off of this. But in that literature, if you read it, it says very clearly that 60%, 60% of it is going to go to pay down the campaign's debts. There you go. I'm seeing the wheels turn. So here's the grift. He's going to raise all of this money to pay off the debt from the campaign. This is a guy that wasted $1.5 billion with a B dollars on one single campaign and is now broke. He's now raising money at the RNC to try to pay off the campaign debt. That has to be paid first before he does anything about whatever legal challenges he thinks he's going to do. He's buying time, trying to pay the debt off on the back.
Is there a deadline?
I don't know if there's necessarily a deadline for the debt to be paid, but
no, I mean for the legal challenges. To
oh
the
yeah,
counts.
yeah, because the electors vote on December 14th. He has now until December 14th to figure out what he's going to do, which, by the way, is going to be nothing. The only challenge that is possible that really isn't a Rocky and Bullwinkle plan, and this is really shitty, but is so Trumpian. Okay, one of the things Donald Trump really loves to do is weaponize due diligence. That is to say, let's talk about his taxes, okay? We didn't find out about his taxes because he released them, like the court told him he had to.
Yeah.
We found out about them from the New York Times.
Yeah, I remember.
Because all of this time, he has lost case after case after case after case after case and kept filing more and more and more in different appeals, even though the Supreme Court had already bounced that shit back and said, nah, that case is good. They didn't even want to hear it. He uses the due diligence of the court to weaponize it to play for time. And he's done that for years.
But that playing for time is also something that plays well with supporters as well.
Well, keeps hope alive, right?
Yeah, and I mean, keeping hope alive is part of the deal of the cult leader or the abusive partner. It's always the hope that you can be fixed. It was really, really interesting. Going back to the fight, because we're going to have to close in a moment, but going back to the cult thing, one of the popular things among evangelical Christians who support Trump is to compare him to the king in the book of Esther in the Bible, who is, of course, the troubling man fixed by the love of a good woman. In some narratives, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but essentially, she convinces the king to put the kibosh on a genocide of her people, essentially, because she's married to him and she's hot. And I'm not even joking, right? It's the one
No,
book
I
in the
know that you're
Bible.
not even joking.
It's the one book in the Bible that doesn't mention God, incidentally. And they love comparing the church to Esther and Trump to the king.
Yeah, no,
They
that's
know
not how
he's
that's
not
gonna
one
work.
of theirs. They know he's not one of theirs, but it's the whole myth about an abusive man who can be fixed by the love of a good woman.
Well, before we go, just so that I
Yeah.
don't miss the end of that thought, in order for the electors to vote, the results of the election have to be certified. What he's trying to do at this point is delay certification so that by the time they get to the votes are not certified, and that the theory goes that they will not be allowed to use the count that they have right now that shows him losing. This is the only plan, and it won't work, but it is the plan that will make a mess of the electoral procedure. Because normally states take ages to certify and nobody cares. They just do the vote anyway because we already know how this is going to go. So even though if it takes months to certify, nobody gives a shit. Now all of a sudden, he's weaponizing certification as a precursor to voting to making the electors vote. And that's the only plan that might not be a Rocky and Bullwinkle plan. But what he's really doing is trying to play for time so that he has an exit strategy. He's already, you didn't hear this because you didn't hear that video. Emily Murphy, who's the person in charge of turning over materials and releasing funds to the transition team, is refusing to do it. There is no transition because they are claiming at the White House that the election is not over. And what this is really about, understand that that's not reality. What this is really about is holding the transition and hence the government hostage. What he actually wants is a federal pardon. You wait.
We'll have to see how that happens. Okay, I think our work here is done this morning. Always a pleasure. So, and I'm going to stop recording.